History is under siege. In an age of tribalism and manufactured outrage, our past is being rewritten faster than it's being read. But understanding history has never mattered more. So strap in, steady your shield, and take your place on the line, because together we're making history's last stand. Well, welcome back, Tristan. It's great to be with you again. We've seen so much about the successors. We've seen the death of Alexander, the rise and the fall of Perdiccas. Yep. We've had stolen bodies, hungry hippos. We've got Ptolemy and his gang down in Egypt, walking like an Egyptian, fighting like a Macedonian. But there is now a bit of a power gap, and different players are all having their own crack at the top job, trying to become the top dog in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest of Persia, the Middle East, and even to parts of Central Asia. Yeah. So can you take us on in the next chapter of this story as to how do things pan out for these emerging kingdoms in Greece, Egypt, the Middle East, and everywhere where Alexander was boss over?
Big question. Well, it's lovely to be back as well. Right, yes, so we're going to cover quite a lot in this one, aren't we? And I will try not to inundate you with too many names, because it can get one of the things which turns a few people off in this period is because there are so many names. There's so many figures who rise and fall very quickly. Their lucks can change very quickly as well, but I'll try and focus on some of the main ones as well. But yes, so where do we leave off? Kind of Perdiccas' death and Antigonus is rising to the fore, right? So yes, and it's very much this case that these ambitious figures who have survived the time of Perdiccas, and they've emerged the victors of that initial war. Very much you see a few of their stars are rising. So you have Antigonus in Asia Minor at that time. You have Antipater, the old Antipater, is in his late 70s by this period, but he's still a formidable figure. Ptolemy in Egypt, and other figures will now slowly rise to the fore. But what you get is, and Antigonus is very much, he's always in the centre of this. There is an agreed settlement at a place called Triparadisus after the death of Perdiccas, kind of resetting of who controls what in the empire, who is going to be the regent, and, this is going to be what it's going to be until Alexander's son comes of age, which is still, more than 10, 12, 13 years away. So a long time still to go. But what you get within a year of that is that settlement completely falls apart. And from our sources, one of the key things for this does seem to be this figure of Antigonus, who is also quite old by this time. I think he's in his 60s or so. So he's a member of the generation that is slightly older than the likes of Perdiccas and other figures that will become prominent, like Seleucus.
And he's embedded in Asia Minor.
He is. So kind of like think of the area of around Ankara today, like kind of central Anatolia. He was originally the governor of a place called Phrygia, but over time his control spreads much further than that to control quite a lot of the western seaboard, which either he directly controls or his allies control. There's one region that isn't, but he will get control of that quite quickly. And then the southern coast of Anatolia as well, places like kind of Lycia and Pamphylia, these ancient regions, and all that area. I'm trying to remember what the name of the modern cities are down there, but it's lost. It's gone from my mind. I apologise, Mike. Geography, never my strong point. But what we get, Xanthus and the like, something like that. But what you get at that time is Antipater dies within a year or so of that new settlement, and they pick a new man to become the new regent. And this was one of Antipater's allies, one of his commanders, a man called Polyperchon. But Antigonus does not want to take orders from Polyperchon. Quite a similar story to what we've had earlier. We've not wanted to take orders from Perdiccas and Ptolemy, but Perdiccas and like, not wanting to accept the authority of someone who he saw as less capable than himself, not willing also to give up his power and control of the big army that he had control of. And also the fact that Antipater's son, a man called Cassander, also wants to become the new regent, wants to become Antipater's successor in Europe. And he seeks help from Antigonus. And Antigonus decides, right, I will help you. And you can then go off to Egypt. Not to Egypt. You can then go off to Greece, make your bases somewhere like Athens and the like, and start fighting against Polyperchon. You guys fight it out amongst yourselves there, and then I'll invade from the north. We'll defeat Polyperchon, then we'll decide what to do, and then I'll start, expanding eastwards as well. So he's got all these ideas for big plans, but other key generals kind of, it's not a story of just one side. Antigonus has all these ambitions, and he does start slowly to consolidate his power and very much going against the settlement. But then you get figures like Polyperchon and the like reacting. And what they do is they form their own kind of coalition against the likes of Antigonus and Cassander. And so the next one you get is kind of Polyperchon and Eumenes, the man we talked about in the past episode, the previous kind of subordinate of Perdiccas.
And is he in Syria?
He is. Well, he had been under siege by Antigonus. But Antigonus and Eumenes, they don't have the best relationship, but they don't have the worst relationship. Antigonus had beaten Eumenes in battle recently by this time, and Eumenes had been besieged within this small, cramped fortress. And we hear about the conditions within this fortress. There's barely enough room for the horses to train, and there's some horrific kind of contraptions they use to make the horses keep doing their exercise, which is basically to lift them up, and the horse is panicking and they're running. So it is animal cruelty today, but you hear stories of that, like how they're very confined in there for some time. But Antigonus tries to do a deal with Eumenes, because Eumenes has already proven his worth as a commander by this time, basically saying, look, listen, Eumenes, I want to, I've got big ambitions, but I want you by my side, and together we can rule, kind of thing. So he sees Eumenes as a key ally. But Polyperchon then sends his own message to Eumenes once Antigonus has released him from that fortress, because Eumenes has said, okay, I'll do that. I'll join you, Antigonus. And Polyperchon then sends his own message to Eumenes saying, actually, no, I want you to join me. And he's persuaded to join Polyperchon with offers of money, offers of men, and also the backing of Alexander the Great's mother, this formidable woman called Olympias. And so what you get is the kind of the drawing of lines once again in the sand. You have Polyperchon versus Cassander in Greece and Macedonia, and also Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother, who will side with Polyperchon. And then in Asia, whilst Ptolemy is still consolidating in Egypt, he's expanded a bit into Syria by this time, you have Antigonus versus Eumenes. And this is kind of like the big theatres of war for the next couple of years. There's other stuff going on, of course. You've got Lysimachus in Thrace, he's kind of consolidating his position. You've got the Athenians as well. They're not sure what to do with the Macedonian garrison, and they want their freedom back, and Polyperchon seems to want to give them that, but then Cassander takes control of the port and all of that. So the Athenians are very much torn between which way to go and that, and which side to support. There's another story, figures like Phocion and Hagnonides, and too many names. I'll stop that now. But what you then get in those next couple of years is you get Eumenes and Antigonus slowly edging eastwards. So Eumenes is forced to go further and further east. I think the original idea was to try and unite with Polyperchon, and then they could fight Antigonus together. That falls apart because Polyperchon proves pretty incompetent as a military leader, so much so that he tries to attack one city in Greece with his elephants, and it's a complete disaster. They're ambushed in the streets, and many of them get their feet impaled in spikes, and it's a complete. And many of the Greek cities see this and think, right, you might have a strong army, but you've proven yourself terrible. So they go over to Cassander. So it doesn't really work well for Polyperchon in Greece. So Antigonus focuses with Eumenes in the east. They go further and further east. They fight battle after battle, and then there's one final battle at a place called Gabene in modern-day Iran. And in that battle, Eumenes has done all of his tricks in the past to win, and to really make Antigonus pay, really stifle Antigonus. But at the end of the day, there's one kind of key tactic in the battle where Antigonus gets round the back of Eumenes' army, takes out the baggage train, which includes the families of one of Eumenes' key units, which are the veterans of Alexander the Great's army, the notorious Silver Shields, who by this time are still fighting, but they're fighting for Eumenes. And when they hear that Antigonus has got the baggage, they got their families and all that, they hand him over, and Eumenes is killed. And then at that point, Antigonus is very much the top dog in Asia at that time. He's the lord of Asia by this time. Effectively, the whole of the Alexander the Great's empire east of the Aegean Sea, except for Egypt and Ptolemy's control, Antigonus is now basically the top dog of. What you get in Europe at the same time is Polyperchon's star falls, Olympias is killed, and Cassander rises to the top there as well. So you have kind of Cassander in Europe, you have Ptolemy in Egypt, and you largely have Antigonus controlling this big swathe of land in Asia. And that's about 315 BC. So we've gone quite a way from Perdiccas's death already.
And what's happening in the eastern theatre of the empire around Babylon, Persia?
Yeah, no, great question. So at that time, Babylon had been put into the hands of a man called Seleucus, who is now the next figure who's going to really rise to prominence at that time.
I was going to say that name's got to appear at some point.
Seleucus, of course, Seleucid Empire later. So he becomes a very, very big figure. Persia had been ruled by a fascinating figure called Peucestus, who was like the only of Alexander the Great's generals that we hear who really does buy into Persian culture, like Alexander the Great had done, like Persianization and the like. But he is then taken away as governor of Persia by Antigonus. And actually, I think he just serves with Antigonus for much of his life. I think we hear of him a bit later on. But you've got Seleucus in Babylon, and Babylon's such a key city, prestigious history. You've still got the astronomical diaries being written in cuneiform, all of this kind of ancient culture there. Worship of the chief god Marduk is happening as well. So you've got the walls of Babylon, the legendary fabled hanging gardens, if they are there, the palaces of Nebuchadnezzar, and so on. It is still one of, if not the greatest city in the ancient world. And Seleucus is holding it, but then he gets chased away by Antigonus. So Antigonus comes back. The next stage is he does away with a few of his rivals in the area, and he also wants to do away with Seleucus, because Seleucus is the one who's also wary of Antigonus' ambitions and what he wants to do next. And Seleucus barely escapes with his life, and he flees to Ptolemy. And so once again, you get kind of the next stage in the wars of the successors, which is Antigonus is dominant at this time. Ptolemy is wary. Seleucus is with Ptolemy at that time, and they're figuring out what to do with this very prominent figure whose star seems to be rising. Cassander is trying to consolidate his area in Macedonia. And what will happen is a couple of years later, you'll get the next kind of big battle in the series of battles between these figures, which happens at Gaza, of all places. And this is a battle between Antigonus' son Demetrius, who is a new figure that rises onto the stage. He's quite young, Demetrius, but he becomes a big figure in the wars of the successors, and the army of Ptolemy. And Ptolemy's army wins this battle. And so this is a bit of a kind of a halt in Antigonus's ambitions at that time, the fact that Ptolemy has been able to stop Demetrius and this army in its tracks. But it's not conclusive, because the Antigonids come back. They fight more wars in that area. They go against the Nabateans, of all people, who become very big much later with Petra and the incense trade. So there's a story of them fighting against, and like the bitumen as well from the Dead Sea and the like. But it's at that time that Seleucus is given a small army by Ptolemy, and he goes back to Babylon and he retakes control of Babylon. And so this is when you see like the story of Seleucus really starting to rise. Because we don't have much surviving in the source material. When we have a little bit, particularly from the Babylonian records as well. But we hear about him taking over Babylon from Antigonus's deputy there. And then he will slowly expand his power. And he's very much looking like eastwards as well. So kind of east of the Euphrates is that kind of area of Seleucus. So there are a couple of attempts by Antigonus and Demetrius to get that back from Seleucus, which don't seem to be very successful. And ultimately, if we then go down to, let's say we'll stop first of all about 311 BC, because this is an important period. So we're now some 13 years after the death of Alexander the Great. Antigonus and Demetrius are still powerful in Asia and Syria, but Seleucus is now back on the scene east of the Euphrates, Babylon area. Ptolemy is still in Egypt, and Cassander is in Macedonia, and they're all fighting a bit over the Greek city-states at the same time, and and also in Western Asia Minor, Western Anatolia. So there's all kind of back and forth and generals fighting over there. I won't go into that, but all very interesting campaigning that's going on. And then there is something that they supposedly reach a peace, like a big peace together. And what happens following that is you get the last remnants of Alexander the Great's family, at least on the male side, being killed off. So, we've talked about Aridaeus, King Philip Aridaeus in the past episodes, haven't we? The elder brother of Alexander the Great.
We have, yes.
Who's effectively, up to that point, he's been a pawn, and actually he's not there by that point anymore. He's been killed. He was killed a few years earlier as two factions were struggling for control of Macedonia, Cassander versus Polyperchon. And at one point, Polyperchon's team, which was led by a figure called included the mother of Alexander the Great, Olympias, takes over, and she wants vengeance. And what she does is she kills Philipparadaeus III, and also she murders his ambitious wife, a young princess called Adaea Eurydice. And there's a horrific story where she supposedly gives her she's in a cell where her dead husband is already lying, deceased, and I think she's given a noose or a sword, and basically said, I don't know if she's given poison as well, but it's like, you choose how you want to kill yourself. And then she's left to choose. And I think she kind of garrots herself or something to try and take away this idea that she chose a method that Olympias wanted her to choose. So kind of one last act of defiance kind of thing. But the key thing there, Aridaeus sorted out a picture. So Alexander the Great's elder half-brother is dead. A few years later, Cassander decides to do away with Alexander the Great's kid, who by that time is reaching teenage years. So officially, all of these generals who have risen to power, who've gained all of this power over the time, when that king comes of age, he is the new top dog. They've all got to bow down to him. That's the official line, even at that time, right? None of these generals are going to give up the power that they now acquired, the ambitions that they have, wanting to emulate Alexander the Great and the like, Cassander included. And what he does is he does away with this kid, with Alexander the Fourth. So Alexander the Great's sole male heir, full heir, legitimate heir, is killed alongside his mother, Roxana, who also has an extraordinary life. She's in Macedonia by this time, but she'd grown up in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. Been in Babylon. She's been with the army so much of the time, been ferried around with her young kid, ends up in Macedonia, a completely foreign land to where she grew up, and then she's done away with as well. There is an illegitimate son of Alexander the Great that then the successor, Polyperchon, tries to rise back into the fore. Doesn't really work for him, but he champions this illegitimate son to say, actually, he's called Heracles. This is the new king, and he tries to get people to support that. But then Cassander seems to reach out to him and make him change his mind, and then he gets rid of Heracles as well. So that's the other kid of Alexander the Great. It doesn't sound
like it's a good, healthy option, being a member of Alexander's family.
Not if you're a male heir, not by this time. So all the male heirs are now out the way. It's around this time or a bit later that the full sister of Alexander the Great is also killed off, because people see her, Cleopatra, her name's Cleopatra. So this is the original Cleopatra, or one of the originals, before you get the famous Cleopatra the Seventh of Egypt, long before that. Around this time, she's also killed. I think it's on Antigonus's orders, because they get word that she is interested in marrying one of his rival king warlords. And once again, that will give you a direct link to Alexander the Great's family. So all of a sudden, you see the killing off all these members of Alexander's family, right?
Yeah, it's Shakespearean in the murders and the mayhem.
Yeah, but it shows that even though they emulate and they have Alexander the Great on their coinage and all of that stuff, it doesn't stop them from being okay with murdering members of his own family if it means that they can effectively try and twist the history books to make themselves be the legitimate successors in various parts of Alexander's empire. Ptolemy is already working on that, on steroids. There's already developing the story that Alexander the Great was actually the son of the last native Egyptian pharaoh of Egypt, called Nectanebo II. So this idea that then Alexander was the legitimate successor of Nectanebo. The Persians were the usurpers. They were the ones who were the foreign rulers. And then once Alexander dies, Ptolemy is the next in line. So he's legitimizing himself at the same time. There's also this kind of other rumors on the side that Ptolemy is actually the son of Alexander the Great's actual father, Philip II, which also should kind of give him a link to the royal family. But they wouldn't work together, because one, you're dismissing the father, and then the other one, you're trying to align with the father. But evidently they were both used to try and promote Ptolemy's legitimacy in Egypt. And it seems to work, because the Egyptians are, you don't hear any revolts against Ptolemy I. But I want to highlight that because that's an important moment. Because what you'll then get is you'll get another big clash a few years later, a big naval clash off the island of Cyprus. It's the Battle of Salamis, the lesser-known Battle of Salamis, where Demetrius and Ptolemy face off again, but Demetrius wins this time. So he wins a sea battle. He takes control of Cyprus, which is a very strategic island, by the way. Ptolemy really wanted to keep control of it. But in the aftermath of that, Antigonus and Demetrius, They're powerful again, and they decide, well, Antigonus takes the royal purple. He names himself king for the first time, invites his son Demetrius also to be called king. Ptolemy hears about it, Cassander hears about it, Lysimachus hears about it, and they all follow suit. So all of a sudden now you have kingdoms, and Seleucus as well. So they all kind of call themselves king by this point. And so we get to kind of like the ending few years of the Successor Wars. The next big event that's tooted, there's an invasion attempt of Egypt by Antigonus, following in Perdiccas' footsteps. No crocodile eating this time.
No hungry hippos.
No hungry hippos. But it still doesn't work out for Antigonus because the invasion fails. Big fleet, massive a massive army, but he's unable to cross the River Nile. So Ptolemy, once again, is saved by the River Nile. So Antigonus retreats again. They then try their luck, sends Demetrius off to the central Aegean, to the central Mediterranean, and the island of Rhodes, which is another key island on that. This is now when trade ships, the trade route between Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming increasingly important. And you will see over the following decades and centuries, that Rhodes becomes a very powerful maritime power because one of its jobs is effectively, in a weird kind of way, the police force of this trade, and that you've got pirates along the southern coast of Turkey and the like. So they become a very important maritime power. But they also, Antigonus and Demetrius recognize the importance of Rhodes back then. And the Rhodians stay loyal to Ptolemy. So then there's a big siege of Rhodes. It's a fascinating story, worthy of its own episode. Demetrius, he sieges the harbour with a massive fleet, and he constructs these big towers on his ships as well, and some we've got artillery pieces, which are these torsion catapults which fire bolts and stones outside the harbour. But he's also got a big land army as well, and he builds these massive siege towers unlike anything the world's seen before, digging underneath the walls of the city as well, so sapping. So all of these mega contraptions that he builds to help assault the city. He gets the nickname Demetrius the Besieger. Some argue it's an ironic nickname because he's actually not very good at sieging because it doesn't work for him. Others say that it was actually it wasn't meant to be ironic. But I actually do agree with the former. It probably was meant to be an ironic nickname. But that siege fails. It's like 8 months long, but Demetrius cannot get through. There are attacks on the harbour of Rhodes by Demetrius, kind of these towers on ships going forwards, but then the Rhodians send fire ships, I think, and the like, and they set some alight, and Demetrius' soldiers take parts of Rhodes under their control, but then the Rhodians fight them back. They dislodge the attacking force of Demetrius, and ultimately Demetrius he stops doing it. And then Rhodians, it's like their finest hour, and that will lead to them. Demetrius abandons his siege equipment apparently, and with the bronze that's left over in those siege weapons, they'll melt it down and they will create one of the wonders of the ancient world, which is the Colossus of Rhodes. So it actually originates from their finest hour, which is their defeat, their ability, one island, one city, to successfully defend against the superpower of the time.
Reminds me of the Maltese resistance of the Italians and the Germans.
Yeah.
Since Malta was like literally the most bombed island of the Second World War.
Yeah.
So those little Mediterranean islands often punch above their weight.
Well, this one certainly did on that occasion. And there are sieges of Rhodes throughout history, aren't there? But I think the 305, 304 one, is like my favourite, and it's an extraordinary story. Then Demetrius goes off to Greece. Stays in the Parthenon for a bit, which becomes known as a whorehouse because he gets his courtesans up there, and he lives in the Parthenon for a bit in Athens when he takes back control of it. But that doesn't last too long. Cassander, he's still fighting against Cassander in Greece, and that's the big battles that are happening there. Antigonus is staying in Asia and Syria at that time. This is another big thing we start seeing now is they start naming cities. They start founding cities and naming them after themselves, which is following in the footsteps of Alexander. Alexandria is still being built at this time, actually, in Egypt, but Ptolemy is probably going to start moving his capital there very soon. But Antigonus founds a new capital on the Orontes River in Syria, northern Syria, calls it Antigonea. This will be taken over by the Seleucids later on, and the son of Seleucus is a man called Antiochus. And Antigonea will be renamed Antioch. And so that's the origins of Antioch, is Antigonus, actually. So a bit more fighting, a bit more diplomacy here, there, and everywhere. But it ultimately ends up in the titanic clash of the successors. Some people like to put 301 BC as the end of the Successor Wars. I like it because it ends in the massive battle, which is the Battle of Ipsus. And in this battle, it is Antigonus and Demetrius, with an army of over 100,000 men, probably about that, over 100,000 men, including some elephants, lots of infantry, cavalry from all corners of their Asian empire, against Seleucus and Lysimachus. And also, I think there's a general of Cassander there as well. But they've all teamed up together to fight Antigonus and Demetrius one last time. And Antigonus is the one of all of them that they think, like, this is the guy, if he wins this, he will finally take control.
He's the man to beat.
He will basically become the next Alexander, kind of taking control of almost everything that
you might even say this is their last stand.
Oh, there you go. It's a climactic battle. We don't know what would have happened if Antigonus had won. Sorry, I've just given a spoiler there, but I think we kind of knew probably going to happen there. Ptolemy is also part of this alliance, but it's a funny one with him. He has gone out of Egypt before. He has this kind of interesting tour of the central Mediterranean and eastern Mediterranean world in like 311, 310. And again, at this time, he sends an army up the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean into what is today Lebanon and ancient Phoenicia. And he besieges a city, but then he hears this story that apparently, Seleucus and Lysimachus and they've been defeated already. And so he panics and he actually retreats back to Egypt. Ah. So his forces never join up with the battle that happens there. But then you get this massive clash. Seleucus and Lysimachus with their massive armies. Seleucus has been in India, of all places, only a year or so before. He's fought against the famous Chandragupta Maurya, kind of the founder of the Mauryan kingdom. You get Ashoka later and the like. And he has effectively sacrificed the territories east of the Hindu Kush. And maybe I think it's also a bit of Gedrosia as well, which is the land to the south and west of the Indus River Valley, I think in southeast Iran today. He's sacrificed quite a bit of that to the Mauryan Empire in exchange for about 400 or 500 war elephants. And so he's got these massive war elephants. He's made peace with this, this Mauryan king, Chandragupta. And if we knew more about this march back westwards in the amount of time he does it, it would be, in my opinion, probably be like another kind of Hannibal crossing the Alps.
Oh, wow.
But like not with the Alps thing, but it's just the distance that he covers to get back with his army to what is Western Anatolia, where Ipsus is. In the space of a year or so, or maybe less than a year, but he marches all the way back from India with his new war elephants, with his army, and he joins up with Lysimachus, who had been in Bulgaria today, kind of Thrace, kind of got a kingdom up there, and they have an army also about 100,000 or so. And, they meet at Ipsus, and the result is a victory for Seleucus and Lysimachus. The story goes that it's quite evenly matched, but then Demetrius charges with his cavalry like Alexander the Great, leading from the front. Antigonus is 80 by this time, so he's got a little bit of a past to I think he's watching on at this time. But Demetrius is attacking the cavalry opposite him, and then he sees that cavalry. He seems to be winning his fight, and the cavalry run away, and he chases after the cavalry on that side of the flank.
Oh, sounds like feigned retreat.
Kind of. Because then he finally turns around. And what Seleucus has done in the meantime is that he has put his elephants, hundreds of war elephants, blocking Demetrius' path back to the battle. And so Demetrius is stumped. He can't get around these war elephants. Elephants and cavalry. Elephants win. I think cavalry don't like the smell of elephants, but they're not the best to attack elephants with. So Demetrius kind of cancelled out. And what happens next is that Antigonus's army's flanks are exposed, and Lysimachus and Seleucus's remaining troops, they sweep up the Antigonid line. And Antigonus, their story is that he waits for Demetrius to come back. He never loses hope in his son. But he's ultimately disappointed because he's killed in a shower of javelins, and he dies on the field at Ipsus. And his death really does mark for many people the end of the initial successor period, because it is the end of this kind of big Antigonid kingdom in Asia. And at the same time, it will be the confirmation of the Ptolemies ruling in Egypt, Seleucus ruling in Asia.
Yep.
And for the meantime, Cassander in Macedon. That won't remain the case. Demetrius will come back in, and actually an Antigonid kingdom is formed in Macedonia. But that's the next part of the story.
But certainly for Judea, Palestine, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are going to fight over this area.
Yes.
And that's going to have a big impact eventually on Judean history.
Yes.
And that's going to lead eventually to the reconstitution of a Judean kingdom.
Yes.
Leading into the Herodian or the Maccabeans or the Hasmonean dynasty.
Yeah.
and the Herodians. So it does have a direct impact on some of the, immediate history of Palestine, Judea.
Absolutely. And what I love about that is, that disputed territory, and then you get those Syrian wars that happen between the Seleucids and Ptolemies. And Ptolemies take control of that area for a large amount of time in the century or so afterwards. But, you get mentions of it in like Appian and the story of the Syrian wars. But what I also love is that you get references to it in the book of Daniel, of all books. Supposedly set in 6th century Babylon, Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar and the like there. But then they're clearly talking about a king of the north and a king of the south. And, fighting over the territory again and again, and actually being pretty accurate to an extent, about what actually happens with the passing of territory back and forth. There is that prophecy of the 7th Syrian war, which doesn't actually come anything from Book of Daniel. But as you say, Seleucids finally take control 2nd century BC, the likes of Jason, and then Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This idea of forcing maybe Greek culture on the people, then the Maccabean revolt.
Yeah, well, I've heard some interesting debates about this, and maybe I can get your thought on that. The story that we've been given in a lot of sources is that the Seleucids tried to forcibly Hellenize Judea, and then the Maccabeans launched a revolt. But I'm now come across some research that suggests it was the other way around, that the Maccabeans attempted to launch a revolt and throw off the Seleucids, and it was only then that they tried to forcibly Hellenize the region. So there's a little bit of a debate in scholarship what came first, the Hellenization or the Judean revolt. So that's definitely an area I'd like to look at in the future. Certainly the Maccabean uprising is a pretty epic event in Judean history. But before we end, Tristan, one thing I want to know, did any of these successor kingdoms start encountering some people from the Italian peninsula? Because at the moment, the Romans have broken out of their little city and they're starting to conquer Italy, dominate some of the tribes, even starting to bully some of the Greek kingdoms in their part of the world. Do any of these successor kingdoms start coming across some people who speak Latin and like spaghetti?
Not sure about the spaghetti thing, but well, if you talk about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, no, not really. And maybe actually with the Ptolemies there probably would be trade, because the Ptolemies, soon Alexandria becomes the capital, big trading hub. I can imagine that some traders did go along the Mediterranean and then up towards like Latium and central southern Italy and traded with them, because the Greeks had trading routes with the with the Etruscans long before the rise of Rome. So that is a well-known trading route even at that time. Yes, they will. They will quickly, especially the kingdoms further west, and it is epitomized by perhaps the most fascinating figure of the second generation of successors, if you will, which is the figure of Pyrrhus.
Yes.
Which we all know Pyrrhus, and the word Pyrrhic victory, where you win the battle but lose the war, a victory at very high cost. And he is a king of a small Hellenistic kingdom to the southwest of Macedon called, well, we like calling him Pyrrhus of Epirus. Sometimes in my little kind of nerdy hat say like Pyrrhus, king of Molossia and leader of the Epirots, because the Epirus is the wider region, and then Molossia is a particular people. Then you've got the Chionians and the Thesprotians. So is this like modern day Albania, that sort of area? It's southern Albania, northwest Greece. Okay, that kind of area. So you've got like Arta, yes, but it kind of crosses the boundary there area. But interesting, Pyrrhus is one of his forebears had an interaction with the Romans before that time. And this is another story. I'll summarize it briefly. When Alexander the Great goes east to fight the Persians in the 330s and 320s, in the 330s, 334 BC, the same year that Alexander the Great goes east, another king, also called Alexander, the king of Molossia, goes west. And he fights in southern Italy. Now, he doesn't fight the Romans because the Romans haven't got into southern Italy at that time. Southern Italy is a place where you've got these extraordinary Greek cities, Tarentum, Paestum, you've got Croton and the like, all along Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, extraordinary cities. And you've got peoples like the Lucanians, the Italian peoples there, Samnites a bit further. He never fights the Romans, but supposedly he does actually, when he's at the height of his success in southern Italy, this Alexander, he does have a diplomatic talk with the Romans. But then we hear nothing else. Fast forward to Pyrrhus, and in that 50 years or so, yes, the Romans are very much becoming the top dog. They defeated the Samnites, They're going towards southern Italy. They're very much being a threat to the Greek city-states in the south, the big one being Tarentum, modern-day Taranto. And the Tarentines call for help from Pyrrhus. And then you get the Pyrrhic War, the fighting between Pyrrhus and the Romans. From my reading of it, Pyrrhus does win the first battle against the Romans, and I would still argue it's a pretty convincing victory, the Battle of Heraclea. But he does lose some key troops, key Molossan troops, like the equivalent of Alexander's foot companions, his Pesatirae. He loses quite a lot. But it's the next battle, the Battle of Asculum, which is the clear Pyrrhic victory, in which he wins, but at a great cost. And all of these anecdotes later, written in Roman times, are like saying that Pyrrhus was amazed at the discipline and these aren't barbarians that I'm facing, these are extraordinary fighters and the like. So take it with a pinch of salt. But the Romans do prove a match for Pyrrhus, and Pyrrhus is seen as like the closest of the successors to align with Alexander the Great himself. So it's a big achievement, and the Romans do still, even in their sources, even in their accounts, they still very much show how great Pyrrhus was, because they want the reader also to think, if Alexander the Great had come west, imagine how he'd have faced. Pyrrhus is quite similar, and we beat him. Could we beat Alexander as well? Yeah,
it's an amazing alternative history.
Yeah, and sorry, and it will continue. The Romans will invade Greece and fight the big Hellenistic kingdoms. First, the Antigonids in the late 3rd century BC, early 2nd century BC, and then the Seleucids, the big power in Asia, and then they will ultimately take control of the Ptolemies much later on. Herod as well, the Herodian dynasty, very much a Roman client state at that time. And then, the Ptolemies become a client state in the 1st century BC, time of Caesar and the like. Cleopatra.
Yeah.
Before the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra versus Octavian, when Ptolemaic Egypt, the last of the great successor kingdoms, is absorbed into the Roman Empire. So it's quite funny how the end of the era of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the big ones, is very much intertwined with the transition of Rome from republic to empire.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case, Tristan. It's certainly important for Judean history as the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are battling over that area. It's effectively the soccer field between them until it emerges independently. And it's also setting the scene for the eventual arrival of the Roman Republic, and it morphs into the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Tristan, it has been excellent to have these conversations with you. For our listeners and viewers, you should know you can follow and listen to Tristan over at the Ancients podcast, and keep an eye out for his forthcoming book on the successors. Tristan, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to sit here with you and to talk about these fascinating stories of the generals, the kings, the battles after Alexander the Great. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for joining us on History's Last Stand. Join me next time as we hold the line and keep the past alive, its meaning, its relevance, and its power. I'm Mike Bird. Until then, take care.